Well, good morning again, and thank you all for your presence. It's a blessing to be together on the Lord's Day to remember Christ and his sacrifice, and look forward to just a few minutes spent in considering our lesson for this morning. For those who are visiting with us, we have been going through a theme this year of being Christ image bearers, bearing his image. And the idea there is that we want to represent Christ to others. And so the ideal state is that when others see us, what they see instead of us is they see Jesus. None of us claims to be there yet, but that is the ultimate goal. And last week, Andrew Bean gave a lesson summarizing where we have been so far this year, just contemplating the lessons that we've seen already this year. And so today we kind of kick off the stretch run, if you will, for the rest of the year. We're going to be talking about Jesus the servant. I'm going to need to turn my screen on, or otherwise I'll have to look up there to see my notes, because I don't have that many notes. Jesus the servant. You think about Jesus, and that is really central to who he was, central to his purpose, central to his mission. And so as we get into this, I hope we see that this was what Jesus was all about, was being a servant. And as we bear his image, then we are called to be the same thing. So Jesus the servant was first foretold by the prophets. And specifically, think about the prophet Isaiah. Whoa. Go ahead and do these first two. So in the book of the prophecy of Isaiah, we have what are called the servant songs or servant poems, 4 different texts that talk about this coming one, this coming servant. And we recognize that as also being Jesus, the Messiah, the anointed one of God. And so in chapter 42, the first 9 verses is the first of these. And kind of the central theme of that particular servant song is that he will bring forth justice to the nations, bringing justice to the nations. And if you think about a king and how he would come and act, this is in contrast to that. This is one who comes as a servant, and his idea is to bring justice. He's not going to cry out. He's not going to make his voice heard in the street. The text says there, and then it's repeated in the New Testament, quoted by the New Testament, that he would not break a bruised reed, or he would not extinguish a lightly burning wick. That is, his actions were humble, and his whole mission and emphasis was on serving others by bringing forth justice to the nations. In Isaiah 49, we see another servant song. It says here, to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the preserved ones of Israel. So there is a restoration of the nation of Israel, of God's people. But we also see, and this was also included in the first one in chapter 42, so there's a linkage between the two, I will also make you a light to the nations, so that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth. So it wasn't just limited to God's chosen people, it would be to the nations, the Gentiles. And so again, we see the idea of serving these people so that they can have this relationship with God, so that salvation can go to the ends of the earth. In Isaiah 50, we see the servant himself here. It's from his perspective. He says, I was not disobedient, nor did I turn back. I gave my back to those who strike. I have set my face like flint. So really defining here a servant, one who is obedient to the one who sent him. And we start to see the idea that this is going to come at a personal cost to this servant, that he is going to give his back to those who strike, but he is going to remain dedicated and focused, setting his face like flint to accomplish the purpose of the one who sent him. And then finally, Isaiah chapter 52 through and into including chapter 53, which is probably the most familiar of these texts, we see the idea that he was pierced through for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities, and by his scourging, we are healed. So pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities, scourging for our healing. So things that he is enduring in serving another, in serving the world. And so again, we see as Jesus foretold in prophecy that he would be a servant. And then later, after Jesus, we see the idea of Jesus being a servant being retold by the apostles. In Philippians chapter 2, we read, "Therefore, if there is any encouragement in Christ, if there is any consolation of love, if there is any fellowship of the Spirit, if any affection and compassion, make my joy complete by being of the same mind, maintaining the same love, united in spirit, intent on one purpose. Do nothing from selfish or empty conceit, but with humility of mind regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interest, but also for the interest of others." And how or why do we do this? Having this attitude in yourselves, which also was in Christ Jesus, who, although he existed in the form of God, did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped or a thing to be held on to, but emptied himself, taking the form of a bondservant, and being made in the likeness of men, being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. So the prophets foretold that Jesus would be a servant, and retold by the apostles, talking about the fact that this was his mission. He emptied himself so he could become a bondservant, and he became obedient even to the point of death. So it was all about serving others in obedience to the one who sent him, and in serving those who he came to serve. And in between, sandwiched in between the foretelling by the prophets and the retelling by the apostles, we have Jesus doing the telling and talking himself about his mission as a servant, his role as a servant. In John chapter 6, verse 38, Jesus said, "I have come down from heaven not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me." It's a good definition of a servant. Not to do what he wants to do, but to subjugate that to the will of the one who had sent him. That is what a servant does. In Mark chapter 9, verse 35, sitting down, he called the 12 and said to them, "If anyone wants to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all." So in talking about the kingdom that he had come to establish and the nature of that kingdom, the preeminent one is the one who is serving others. If you want preeminence in the kingdom, put all others above yourself and serve them. And then finally, if I can get it to advance. Oh, there we go. In Mark chapter, let me go back. In Mark chapter 10, verses 42 through 45, Jesus calling them to himself, Jesus said to them, "You know that those who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. But it is not this way among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you shall be slave of all. But even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." So in that last statement, really giving his mission and purpose, that he came to serve. And so again, prophesied by the prophets, this would be his nature, retold by the apostles, and Jesus himself talking about this is what he came to do. And finally, it was modeled by Jesus. I could have inserted another slide, just simply said that it was lived by Jesus. If you look at the actions of Jesus, his interactions with people, the miracles he's performed, you see that his every action he ever took was for the benefit of someone else, for serving someone else. Even after his resurrection, remember he asked for some food. "Is there food here to eat, for me to eat?" Don't you think that was more likely to demonstrate to those people there that he was flesh and blood, that he was not a ghost, rather than the fact that he was hungry? Even in doing that, he was serving someone else. Even in the simple act of eating, it was in service to someone else. And so his life was a life of service. But then in the specific case that we want to look at as we focus in on modeling, Jesus demonstrated that to others. And so this is a well-known text to many, and it's the one that probably many would go to when you think about serving. So I'd like to spend a few minutes just reading this and then making some observations about what Jesus modeled in service. So this is John chapter 13. It reads, "Now before the feast of the Passover, Jesus, knowing that his hour had come, that he would depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During supper, the devil having already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come forth from God and was going back to God, got up from supper, laid aside his garments, and taking a towel, he girded himself. That he poured water into the basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with a towel with which he was girded. So he came to Simon Peter. He said to him, 'Lord, do you wash my feet?' Jesus answered and said to him, 'What I do you do not realize now, but you will understand hereafter.' Peter said to him, 'Never shall you wash my feet.' Jesus answered him, 'If I do not wash you, you have no part with me.' Simon Peter said to him, 'Lord, then wash not only my feet, but also my hands and my head.' Jesus said to him, 'He who has bathed needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean, and you are clean, but not all of you.' For he knew the one who was betraying him. For this reason he said, 'Not all of you, you are clean.' So when he had washed their feet and taken his garments and reclined at the table again, he said to them, 'Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, the Lord and the teacher, washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I gave you an example that you also should do as I did to you. Truly, truly, I say to you, a slave is not greater than his master, nor is one who sent greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them.'" So just going back and looking through that text and seeing some observations about what occurred here as Jesus modeled what it was to serve another. The first thing is that he was motivated by love for those he served. If you look in verse 1, he says, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Jesus did not lead out of, or did not serve out of compulsion or out of fear, but out of love. It was unconditional and unselfish. Those he was serving was not worthy of it. That was not relevant to Jesus because he loved them anyway. And that include serving and loving the one who would betray him. It's sometimes goes without notice that Jesus would have washed the feet of Judas Iscariot as well as the others gathered there, even knowing that he was about to betray him into the hands of the Roman soldiers. So as we think about leading, or serving, I should say, servant leadership, we need to recognize it is to be done out of love. It's not allowed to be done out of compulsion, but recognizing the needs of another person and doing what is in their best interest. The second thing is that Jesus was secure in who he was. In verse 3, it says, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come forth from the God and was going back to God. So Jesus knew who he was. Jesus knew where he was from. Jesus knew where he was going. And Jesus knew about his relationship with God. He had absolutely nothing to prove. He didn't need to demonstrate his superiority over someone else. He had no reason to prove anything to anyone. He was fully secure, and that security enabled him to lower himself to serve those people who were undeserving of his service. What about us? Where does our security lie? Our security should not lie in our own abilities or our own status. Our security should lie in who we are because of Christ. and a relationship we have with God because of Christ, who we are in him. And that will enable us to put others ahead of self and serve them, because we recognize that we have nothing to prove. We have nothing to prove about how great we are, because what we are is only what we have because of what we are in Christ, in his life and his sacrifice. And that security allows us to serve others. The next point is that Jesus led in serving. In verse 4, beginning, it reads that he got up from supper, he laid aside his garments, and taking the towel, he girded himself. Then he poured water into the basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with a towel with which he was girded. We've had some discussion recently about this text or the idea of feet washing. So probably most of you recognize that in this time, in this day and age, the custom was to wash the feet of people as they came into your home. And it was the role of the lowest servant, the lowest slave in the house to do that. It was the most menial, you might say, demeaning task that there was. And they had, even within servants or slaves, they had various ranks, and it was the lowest rank of the lowest servant to do this. And typically, it would have been customary in a situation like this, where they're not in an individual's home, that they would have made arrangements to have a servant come in to take care of the foot washing. And apparently that did not take place. So if it was going to be done, someone was going to have to do it. And you notice that Jesus apparently didn't do it when they all walked in. They were having supper. He got up from supper, and then he took care of the foot washing. So he had given them all the opportunity to lead. They could have, each one of them, or any one of them, could have taken the opportunity to lead in the foot washing as they entered this place. But Jesus was the one who took the lead. He interrupted his supper and to do the most menial task of the lowest servant. He humbled himself by laying aside his garments and washing the feet of men who had walked on dirty and most likely filthy roads, as people would throw their waste into the street. And so these men's feet were probably really dirty. And so he was doing this task. But he is the one who took the lead in doing it. No one asked him to do it. No one suggested he should do it. In fact, as the master and teacher, he would have been the one least likely to anyone thought would have done it. But he took the lead in serving. He demonstrated that no one is above serving. In that very act, he demonstrated that. But he also demonstrated that no one is below being served. You think about his interaction with Peter. When he came to Peter, Peter said, "Lord, do you wash my feet?" Apparently, Peter had the idea that he couldn't believe that the master would stoop to this level of the lowest servant to wash his feet. Or perhaps he was thinking of himself, "I am not worthy to have my feet washed by you." Jesus in this act demonstrated both things. One, that Jesus, as the I am, was not too high to lower himself to serve, but also Peter was not so low that he could not be served. If you think of it as a line, there's not a place below where you can't be served. It doesn't matter your intelligence or your education, your wealth, your social status. There's not a line so low that you can't not be served. That line is at ground level. Everyone is deserving of service. And that helps us as we think about serving others. There is no one who is undeserving of being served. And Jesus demonstrated this both in the act of washing their feet and in his interaction with Peter, letting him know that, yes, I'm going to do this for you. Jesus served the greater need. Peter said, "Lord," after Jesus had responded, "Lord, then wash not only my feet, but also my hands and my head." Well, notice that Jesus didn't do that. Jesus didn't go ahead and do that. Peter didn't need a bath. He talked about how he was already clean. He just needed his feet washed. But I think we all recognize this really wasn't about washing feet to begin with. This was about Peter and the other disciples learning a lesson about service and serving another. But don't you think if Peter had needed a bath, that Jesus would have taken care of that? If Peter was in a situation where he needed a bath and couldn't do it himself, don't we all believe that Jesus would have done that? Because that is what he demonstrated. That is the life he lived. That is what he modeled. That is what he taught. Sometimes the need might require a menial task of washing someone's feet or mowing a lawn or scrubbing a toilet, whatever that need is that might require a menial task. But at the same time, let's not forget the greater need. In this case, demonstrating to his disciples that they needed to learn about being a servant. And when we're interacting with others, there are things that might require a menial task, but let's remember this is also an individual with an eternal soul, and the greater need is that. So let's not get the yard mode, but allow their soul to go in a state that is away from God. And so we see that with Jesus recognizing and serving the greater need. And Jesus also taught servanthood. We looked earlier at some quotes from Jesus as he talked about his mission, his role, what he came to do. It was very clear that this is what he was about, but he also took time as he modeled servanthood to teach about servanthood. And in verse 12, it begins to read, "Do you know what I have done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you're right, for so I am. If I then, the Lord and the teacher, washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I give you an example, that you also should do as I do. Truly, truly, I say to you, a slave is not greater than his master, nor is one who is greater than the one who sent him." So Jesus modeled servanthood, but he also explained what he was doing. Have you ever noticed that sometimes people don't get the point of what you're doing? Sometimes that happens. And we talk about living as an example and that being the greatest thing we can do, and I don't disagree with that, but sometimes people don't always get what the example is. They need to be taught along with that, and Jesus modeled that as well. He did the action, and then he explained, this is what I'm doing, and this is what you should learn from it, okay? So we should do the same. People don't always get the point. So as we model the behavior, we need to make sure, do you understand what I just did and the purpose of what I just did? It really wasn't about this thing, okay? It was about serving. It was about seeking their greater good and whatever the lesson is that you're trying to convey. So Jesus modeled that and taught as well. And finally, as he taught servanthood, he taught the blessing of servanthood. Jesus said in verse 17, "If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them." So Jesus modeled it, he taught it, and then he told the benefit. He told the blessing that came along with doing this thing. It's sometimes easy for us to say, well, this is what you need to do, and stop there. And we get the idea that that should be enough. And ultimately, it should be enough. If God says it, that we should do it, that should be enough. But we see here Jesus giving the blessing. If you know these things, you're blessed if you do them. I'm teaching you to do these things, and a blessing comes along with that. So again, Jesus not modeling that. We should pass along this knowledge to those that we teach and serve. As we model something, teach them what we are doing, what the bigger picture is, and let them know the blessing comes along with doing this, because that's what Jesus did. And the rest of this month, as we have thought about Jesus as a servant, what we want to do is look closer in application and think about serving in our families, in serving in the church and serving in the world. So look forward to those times together, and I encourage you to be here if you can, or to participate online, to think about serving those groups as we also think about ultimately serving like Jesus. Thank you. John?